So the input to the basal ganglia, they're coming from different area. One is coming from the cortex of the brain, from the many areas of the brain, but especially from the frontal lobe and from the parietal lobe. Another area is the centromedian, which is part of the interlaminar nuclei of the thalamus. And the third one is substantia nigra of the midbrain. So there's three different areas that send signals, and the information is received in the striatum, which I talked about it before. So the caudate nucleus and the putamen together is called the striatum. Because striatum is receiving information from different parts of the brain and processing that information together, and then that's why it is called the integrator of basal nuclei, and then it processes information and sends information to thalamus, and that's important for the decision making and direction of the movement and amplitude of movement and emotional expression of the motor movements. It is important for the working memory and for the motivational aspect of the motor behavior. Depends how much of the striatum is activated. You get a different response. If it is very high stimulation, you get euphoria. If it is an average stimulation, you get a seeking behavior. And if it is not much signals are sent, that's called aversion, which is avoiding an interaction. Both cortex of the brain and the basal ganglia are involved in different aspects of the movements, but their role is a little bit different. The cortex of the brain is important for learning different movements and also generation of different activity, but regardless of the outcome. Basal ganglia, on the other side, it selects appropriate actions, appropriate movements, and that is because of the trial and errors. So based on the previous exposure to those kind of movements. So there's a little bit different there. That's why the direction and amplitude of movement is based on the output of the basal ganglia, because already there's some exposure there. So they have that information and they check and balance the movements that are the signals that are coming from the cortex of brain. The output is one of the output is in the thalamus. So thalamus is receiving information from the internal part of the globus pallidus. And this information normally, that the thalamus is normally under inhibition. So unless there's some changes there, nothing is sent to thalamus. So depends on which pathway is used in the basal ganglia. Either the information is inhibited more, so nothing will be sent to thalamus, or that inhibition is released. Then if that inhibition is released, the information can go from basal ganglia to the thalamus, and from the thalamus it can go to the cortex of the brain. So either with an increase sending the information, or it will inhibit sending that information, and that based on the GABA. So the GABA is normally the one that inhibits sending signals from the from the internal part of globus pallidus to the thalamus. So if those neurons are inhibited or not, based on that, you get some activity sent to the thalamus or may not be sent to thalamus at all. Also, the basal ganglia are connected with the ventral peduncular pontine nucleus, which is in the pons, and that is important for the tone of the axial muscles and also hip and shoulder girdle muscles. These are not the only signals that are coming for posture and for the tone. There are other pathways there too from the red nucleus, rubrospinal pathway that is for the upper part of the body, for the tone of upper parts of the body. Also vestibulospinal pathways are there, or tracts are there, and reticulospinal tracts are there too. So they are all working together. So this is not the only area that is important for tone. Basal nuclei are also important for the coordination of learned activities. So one of those learned activities is walking. So dorsal pedunculopontine nucleus receiving information from the basal ganglia and then send information to the spinal cord. Through that, the specific movements, the sequence of the movements of walking happens from the activity of this nucleus. There is a lot of connection between different parts of the basal ganglia and also between the basal ganglia and thalamus and the cortex of the brain. So there is two different pathways there. One is called direct pathway and the other one is the indirect pathway. Before I talked about each one separately, there is a few different names that you can look at it. One is that the fibers are coming from the cortex of the brain and they are going to the basal nuclei. Here is the caudate nucleus and putamen, so it's in striatum, and this is called corticostriatal pathway. Another one is coming from substantia nigra, and that signal, it can be excitatory or inhibitory, and this is called nigrostriatal pathway. Corticostriatal pathway is always excitatory. There is another pathway here between the subthalamic nucleus and the internal part of the globus pallidus, and there is also connection between the external part of globus pallidus with the subthalamic nucleus, and this is called the subthalamic fasciculus. So the connection between globus pallidus and subthalamic nucleus is called subthalamic fasciculus. There is also a connection between the internal part of globus pallidus with the thalamus, and that is called the thalamic fasciculus. There is also a connection between the substantia nigra and subthalamic nucleus. So substantia nigra inhibits subthalamic nucleus, and subthalamic nucleus sends excitatory signals to the substantia nigra. The output from the thalamus is to the cortex of the brain, so that is excitatory, but the input to thalamus depends on the pathway. It can be, normally it is inhibitory, but that inhibition can be suppressed. And the output of the cortex to other parts of the nervous system is excitatory. So now you can look at each different pathway. So this is the direct pathway, and the direct pathway actually increase activity and increase signaling to the thalamus. So that is an important pathway. We can start from here. So cortex is sending excitatory signals to the striatum, and also substantia nigra is sending excitatory signals, and that is through the D1 receptor. So now the striatum is sending signals to the internal part of the globus pallidus. This is these signals that are sent, these are inhibitory signals. So these neurons are excited, are sending signals, are stimulated because of the the signals that are coming from cortex and from subthalamic nucleus, and they are releasing inhibitory neurons. Okay, so this inhibitory neurotransmitters are inhibiting another inhibitory neuron. So that's a little bit confusing. Okay, so this is normally that's happening, that this inhibitory neurons are inhibiting thalamus. So this is normally that's happening. But this inhibition that is coming, these neurotransmitters that are released, then inhibits this. So if there's two inhibition, then the output is positive. So that's why the output increase here in the thalamus. And then the thalamus can send signals to cortex. Cortex will be more awake and processing more information, and that sends signals to other parts of the nervous system or of the body in general. Also, here is a role of the subthalamic nucleus. So here the subthalamic nucleus is stimulating substantia nigra here, and that increase in the stimulation will cause increased output of the substantia nigra to the striatum. So that will also increase overall output of the globus pallidus to the thalamus. If you look at this image, it's exactly the same thing, but it's just an image except of the, like a flow chart or diagram. So here you have the cortex and sends signals to the striatum. So this is the caudate nucleus, and this is the putamen. And now the putamen is sending signals to internal part of the globus pallidus. So this is stimulating inhibitory neuron. Now this inhibitory neuron that's connected between globus pallidus and the thalamus is inhibited. So then the inhibition of the thalamus is gone, and then thalamus now can send signals back to the cortex of the brain. There is also another pathway that's here, and that is from substantia nigra that is stimulating the putamen. One thing that is missing in this image, and you can draw it if you want, is this area that substantia nigra is inhibiting subthalamic nucleus, and subthalamic nucleus is actually exciting or increasing stimulation of substantia nigra. So that area is missing. So you can add a couple of arrows in this area. Indirect pathway decrease output of the basal ganglia to thalamus, so decreasing activity. So here is again cortex of the brain sending excitatory neurons to the striatum, but here substantia nigra is sending inhibitory neurons. So this is dopamine, but dopamine is, they have D2 receptors, and the D2 is an inhibitory. So although there is an interneurons here inside the striatum that is releasing acetylcholine, which is excitatory, but because of this inhibition, it will decrease the effect of this interneuron. So in the indirect pathway, instead of a striatum connecting to the internal part of globus pallidus, now it is connected to the external part of the globus pallidus. Normally, the external part of globus pallidus is inhibiting subthalamic nucleus. That is normally, it's inhibiting subthalamic nucleus. But now you're getting another inhibition here. So if you're getting one inhibition here and this is already inhibited, so this inhibition is inhibiting this one, and the activity of subthalamic nucleus increase. And this is why the output of subthalamic nucleus increase to internal part of globus pallidus, and from there it sends signal to the thalamus. But here, what's going on here, that normally this is inhibited. This neuron is inhibiting thalamus. So this pathway increased inhibition. The direct pathway was decreasing the inhibition. This is actually increasing the inhibition. So which means that fewer signals are sent to thalamus. So if fewer signals are sent to thalamus, thalamus is not processing a lot of information. It will not send a lot of information to the cortex of the brain. So the activity of the cortex of the brain decreases, which means that less signals are sent to the rest of the body. Coming back here, the subthalamic nucleus once again is trying to stimulate substantia nigra here, and this pathway is increased. If this is increased, it means the effect of the signal that are coming from the cortex of the brain is decreased. So subthalamic nucleus works like a pacemaker that's control the amount of signals that are sent to thalamus. So this way it will reduce this effect, and also it blocks this activity, so the amount of signals that are sent to thalamus is decreased. If you look at this image, so you can look at on this side, you can see the cortex of the brain are sending excitatory signals to the striatum. So this is the caudate and putamen, and then is now the putamen, sending excitatory, inhibitory signals to the external part of the globus pallidus. Now, external part of globus pallidus sends signal to the subthalamic nucleus, and then the subthalamic nucleus sending excitatory neurons to the internal part of globus pallidus. So, and then the globus pallidus sending inhibitory neurons to the thalamus. So this inhibition actually increased because this excitation that is coming from the subthalamic nucleus increasing the activity of this neuron, and this is an inhibitory neuron. So less signals are sent from basal ganglia to thalamus. Thalamus usually sends positive signals or excitatory signals to the cortex, but now is decreased. Another thing that is happening is this event, and that is from substantia nigra that is coming to the putamen, and this inhibitory neurons are inhibiting this excitatory interneuron here, so that will reduce the effect of signals that are coming from the cortex of the brain. And again, this is missing something here, like previous slide, this area is missing, so you can add this area substantia nigra is inhibiting subthalamic nucleus, and subthalamic nucleus is actually stimulating substantia nigra. So it depends on the type of behavior and the activity and the movements and the background skills. The a person's response is different from one person to another person.
Thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing to the channel.